Greetings, animals. Welcome back. Click a few more buttons here and we'll get started. Gonna read for an hour or two today. We are live on Odysee, so if you're watching over on YouTube, there's a link in the description to take you to a better land. A land of milk and honey and non-censorious streams. Give me 1 minute just to make sure everything is running here. Looks like we're good. All right. We're coming up on halfway through this book. Let us continue. We're coming up into a whole lot of notes, which means that I'm probably gonna get cantankerous. Okay, let me get my mic situated, and let's begin with the next chapter, titled Ism Schism. Begins with a quote from John Dewey. For in spite of itself, any movement that thinks and acts in terms of an ism becomes so involved in reaction against other isms that it is unwittingly controlled by them. For it then forms its principles by reaction against them instead of by a comprehensive, constructive survey of actual needs, problems, and possibilities. That's a good thing to keep in mind. Not to be so upset and bothered by, for instance, the coercion of the state that it controls you. What would be a good example of that? Get rid of this so it stops making noise. Oh, let's just say that COVID was worse than it turned out to be. And let's just say that the government, mandated all these lockdowns and such, but that COVID was an actual threat. It would be easy for some of voluntarist types to be so off-put by the government forcing and controlling them in certain ways, like with masks or with social distancing or, controlling businesses or whatnot. They would be so off-put by that even though there was an actual threat that might necessitate more of these precautions, that just because they were being coerced into it, they might not, which might make them make more irrational decisions. That's one example of that. Like, don't let the opposition control you unwittingly by you attempting to just resist and be a reaction to everything that your enemies do. It's good to, and I think that kind of goes to what we were talking about over the past several weeks on this channel anyway, and on my interview, for example, with Josh Smith, we talked about how it's important. We need to stop focusing as much on what we don't want, because we've spent a lot of time on that, and we actually need to start building and creating and moving towards what we do want. Okay, anyway. Ism Schism. This chapter is dedicated to dispelling concerns from those who would be quick to label me as being a proponent or opponent of anarchism, capitalism, socialism, communism, Marxism, corporatism, or any other potentially unacceptable or myopic ism. Or any other potentially unacceptable or myopic ism. That makes it sound like anarchism and capitalism are potentially unacceptable or myopic. That's kind of incorrect. This could have just been messy language. Maybe that wasn't what he intended, but if it was, then I'm having a difficult time being confident that he ever actually held the ANCAP position to judge it in that way. Anarchism is not ruling people. That is to say, not using force on people. If you're going to call that potentially, if that could be potentially unacceptable or myopic to you, then maybe we don't want to associate. Anyway, moving on. As I explained in the introduction, I have traveled the world of isms, and I have incorporated lessons from all of them to build a theory of true democracy that best supports the promise of a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, while remaining consistent with nature. What all isms have in common is that they are derived from the law of the jungle, whether people want to acknowledge it or not. Most people are so focused on how stuff is allocated that they ignore how power is allocated in reality. Anarcho-capitalism this is me talking, is almost uniquely focused on making sure that power is not allocated non-consensually. So that seems to be a contradiction, and considering that I don't understand his critique of anarchism and capitalism, or at least I don't understand him looping in non-aggression with isms that allocate power. It's literally the opposite of involuntary power allocation. They chose to give their power to people who promised to use the resulting concentration of power to give them more stuff. What people miss is that by giving away their power, they will get far less in return than what they could have produced had they retained their power. If I had to pick a single ism that most closely reflects my stance, it would be voluntarism. He says voluntarism. I'm pretty sure throughout the book he says voluntarism instead of voluntarism. This is a quibble, but voluntarism is typically groups of people that want to donate their time to charity work. I would suggest that people use the voluntary with a Y, voluntarism, because we want everything to be voluntary. Moving on. That means that I support any form of community organization which has the consent of the governed, demonstrated by the right of secession. Well, let's not forget, this is me talking again. The phrase consent of the governed is a contradiction in terms. That cannot exist. You can see another video on my channel, on this channel, in fact. If you search Disenthrall for consent of the governed cannot exist, you'll see my arguments for that. What's up, Remco? I see you on Odysee. So you got the YouTube, you got the notification for the video on YouTube and then hopped over to Odysee. Hey man, whatever works. Whatever works. That means that I support any form of community organization which has the consent of the governed, demonstrated by the right of secession. From that perspective, I am opposed to universalism, the belief that everyone must be governed by the same principles. While being fundamentally voluntarist, I make arguments from first principles to persuade people to voluntarily adopt systems commonly considered communist, socialist, and capitalist. This chapter will attempt to explain how I resolve these disputes without being internally contradictory, ignoring human nature, or being perceived as economically illiterate. If we are going to have a discussion regarding isms, then it's best to start with definitions. Since this is my book, I get to define the terms as I understand them. Yes, this should have been the first chapter, in my opinion. If you disagree with my definitions, that is okay. You are welcome to have your own definitions, but while you are here, I ask that you set aside your definitions and adopt mine just long enough to follow my reasoning. This should be baseline expected. Anytime you're reading somebody else's work, you need to get ready to put yourself in the frame of mind of using that person's definitions of the words, because it's their intent. It's not their words that we're trying to read here. The purpose of a book is not to read someone's words. The purpose of a book is to be on the receiving end of communication of concepts from the author. So that's why it's important to care about what their definitions are for the purposes of the book. That's why it's important for books to contain their definitions so we know what they mean. So I'm glad that we're doing this. This is awesome. Anarchism. The idea of anarchism is that we should live by rules and not rulers. In prior chapters, I made the case that it is impossible to have rules without rulers because we must reach consensus on what the rules are, how they are to be enforced, and how to resolve disputes. I'm not sure WTF he's talking about. Let me turn my light on so I can see the book better, and then we're going to read that again. What up, Raymond? I see you in the comments. Okay, let's read this again, because that sounded like nonsense. In prior chapters, I made the case that it is impossible to have rules without rulers because we must reach consensus on what the rules are, how they are to be enforced, and how to resolve disputes. Okay. I mean, okay, if this is how he's defining anarchism, then all of my objections previous to this have been invalid, and also, he's not talking about anarchism. Voluntary consensus is not a ruler. I don't know why I don't know where that sentence came from. Voluntary consensus is not being ruled, is not the existence of rulers. It's literally you agreeing to cooperate with other people. Yeah, so I have a huge objection there. Back to the book. An alternative view of anarchism is that it is nothing more than the law of the jungle, where might makes right. Okay, this is me talking again. That is not anarchism. Because when you use might against someone else, and your justification is, well, I'm stronger and I can do that, that's might makes right. That is the law of the jungle, what I call state of nature. That is the absence of any kind of moral framework or moral judgment. That the law of the jungle is not a moral philosophy. This is the same problem I have with consequentialism. Consequentialism is just me saying that my future predictions justify me initiating force on you now. That is precisely the same as the law of the jungle, as this book is talking about. That's just might makes right. Well, of course, the person who is using force on you thinks that the consequences of that will be better than they would have otherwise. That's why they're doing it. And it's I guess what I'm trying to say is, don't confuse might makes right with a moral philosophy. It's the absence of a moral philosophy. That is the state of nature. And it's funny that we're talking about this, because I'm going to be on a Christian show, Liberty After Dark, I think, at 8 p.m. Central tonight. And the reason why he's inviting me on is to talk about the state of nature as a principle, to sort of educate people on what that is and what it means. It is the absence of a moral philosophy. When you use force on somebody, based on whatever, might makes right, law of the jungle, consequentialism, you name it, when you use force on somebody, you are by definition in that moment and in that interaction making yourself that person's ruler. You are trying and attempting to, and maybe even succeeding in, ruling over that other person by force against their consent. That is definitionally not anarchism. So if he's defining anarchism as not anarchism, I think we have a fatal error in the code of this book here. Like, it's one thing to say, okay, we're going to use somebody else's definitions so that we can understand what they're trying to communicate. But he just defined anarchism out of existence. If that's the definition he's going to use. Now, he said an alternative view of anarchism, so maybe that's not his. Let's try and give him the benefit of the doubt there. So let's continue reading and see what comes next. Raymond says, today we have individuals who claim they are fighting fascism. They would never allow the U.S. Constitution to exist, and especially the Bill of Rights. Well, if they're consensual, fine. But probably not the people you're talking about. Anyway, moving on. If anarchism is the law of the jungle, which it is precisely not, it is 180 degrees from, it is the opposite of the law of jungle. It is the elevation out of the state of nature to recognize a moral philosophy, to control one's behavior based on a concept, a moral philosophical concept. That is precisely the opposite of the law of nature. So I'm not going to repeat myself. Let's keep reading. If anarchism is the law of the jungle, then we are at all times living under anarchism, even if groups of people voluntarily agree to a peace treaty that establishes property rights and dispute resolution procedures. We can clearly see that sovereign countries interact under anarchism on the world stage. An anarchist is someone who refuses to voluntarily agree to any higher level peace treaties. What? An anarchist is someone who refuses to voluntarily agree to any higher level peace treaties. That is precisely false. So he says that he used to be an anarcho-capitalist, but that is a direct contradiction to the concept of anarchism. If it's voluntary, then there's no rulers involved, then anarchism doesn't stand in opposition to it. So it would be perfectly acceptable, even encouraged for an anarchist to voluntarily agree to a peace treaty. Even if they don't confess their agreement by word, their actions generally indicate that they prefer peace to war, and that their objections to peace treaties are theoretical. That said, anarchists have no moral issues with breaking laws if they can get away with it. Non-consensual laws. An anarchist has no moral issues with breaking non-consensual laws if they can get away with it, because they're non-consensual, because they didn't consent to it, because that makes those laws invalid and even immoral aggressions. Not all laws. Anarchy is not against. He even said earlier that it's rules, not rulers. Well, then that statement contradicts this understanding of anarchists as having no moral issue with breaking laws. It's not. This is confused. This is confused. They never agreed to a peace treaty and only cooperate to the extent necessary to avoid problems. They could agree to a peace treaty as long as it was consensual on all sides, and therefore would be fine, would have a moral issue with breaking the laws, because those laws would not really be laws in so much as they would be their contractual obligations and agreements, things they voluntarily consented to. They will run stop signs when no one is looking. They will steal, kill, or destroy if they think it serves their interests. What? What? Okay. Okay. Something is going. There has to be something. I have to be misunderstanding something here. It has to be on my end, because this guy's too smart to be holding the position I think that I'm reading that he is. He says he used to be an anarcho-capitalist, but now he's saying that anarchists will steal, kill, or destroy if they don't think it serves their interests. So he used to hold the position that he would steal, kill, or destroy if he thought it served his interest? So one of two things is true here. I'm reading this wrong, because of course he wouldn't hold that position. Or I have been misled as to the person whose work I'm reading. I think that's a true dichotomy. I don't see how it could be anything but one of those two things. I have to have somehow just totally misunderstood this. But I don't see how that could be. In less extreme cases, they will avoid taxes and skirt government regulations. With this perspective on anarchism, everyone who uses whatever physical and social means that are available to them to enforce their rules on everyone else under the law of the jungle is an anarchist. I mean, what? Why would you? I don't understand. I'm struggling. I'm struggling to understand this section. Everyone who uses whatever physical and social means that are available to them to enforce their rules on everyone else under the law of the jungle is an anarchist. The word enforce and the word enforce their rules and anarchist are mutually exclusive concepts. Unless you are defining anarchist to be a person that has no moral framework and is just sort of a state of nature jungle creature, just like no different from a lion that will eat what he wants to eat because it's in his best interests, run from what he wants to run from because he thinks it's his best interest, does what he wants because he's strong enough to do it. If that's his definition of anarchism, then I'm surprised that he claims to have ever been one. If he was ever that, then he is a dangerous person that I can no longer trust. I don't think that, I mean, how can that be? I doubt that's it. What? Okay. I'm not going to keep repeating myself. That section was the biggest dumpster fire in this book. There were so many issues there. Marxism, communism. Next, I'm going to address Marxism because Marx provides a list of essential tenets of communism, namely central banking, government-controlled education, government-controlled labor, government ownership of transportation, government ownership of communication, government ownership of agriculture and industry, elimination of private property, heavy income tax on everyone, elimination of inheritance, regional planning. What is interesting about this list is that the United States, both major political parties, and most of the world support almost every tenet of communism in principle. Every country in the world uses money issued by a central bank. Education is highly regulated at the state and federal level, and the dinos and rhinos are generally resistant to unregulated education. With the COVID-19, quote, pandemic, we have seen that governments around the world have almost unanimously declared the right to tell people whether they can go to work and what they must wear. The governments have recently interfered with private property rights by preventing evictions. For decades, property rights have been violated by civil asset forfeiture. Everyone is subject to an income tax and inheritance tax at the federal level and in most states. Limits on what we're allowed to communicate are rapidly growing, and all the roads, airports, and other transportation is either owned by or so heavily regulated by government that it has de facto ownership via implicit and explicit control. Well said. A country that can do everything that rhinos and dinos support has already assumed total control over everything, even though they allow people to make some choices. The government has reserved the power in principle to exercise complete communist-style control. The rhinos and dinos have already accepted the principles of communism. Any difference is only a matter of degree, such as adjusting the tax rates, increasing regulation, etc. You are considered to be in control of your car even if you take your hands off the wheel because you have the ability to take the wheel at any time. Likewise, governments are in communistic control of the people because they can regulate anything at any time. It seems to me that defining communism based upon the way it is implemented is quite limited. After all, a central bank could have a 100% reserve, gold-backed banking policy. Government-controlled education could still teach critical thinking and lack propaganda. The very purpose of government is to resolve disputes with respect to property. The very purpose of government is to resolve disputes with respect to property. This seems like at least the third different definition of government I've encountered in this book so far. Which means that government is ultimately in control of all property. Therefore, communism can best be described by the intended outcome from the exercise of total control over everything. The outcome is an equality in standard of living for most people. It is an attempt to scale commune-style living arrangements to a larger scale. It is an attempt to eliminate the profit motive. Ironically, those who promote communism often do so in the belief that it will result in a personal profit by redistributing wealth from others to oneself, and those enterprising leaders of the communist movement aim to transfer control from everyone else to themselves, knowing full well that control is wealth. I am completely against attempts to completely or mostly eliminate the natural Pareto distribution of wealth. All such attempts can only destroy wealth, because without profit, producing more value than you consume, there is no justification to take the risks involved in production. I am firmly against communism by this definition. The title of this book, More Equal Animals, is a reference to George Orwell's book Animal Farm. in which the animals attempt to establish communism and declare that all animals are equal. Eventually, the pigs take over the farm and start to live like the farmer they overthrew. The outcome being that the animal constitution was reinterpreted to all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. If you guys, this is me talking, if you guys have not read More Equal Animals, definitely need to do that. The animals had hoped to form a society where everyone was equal, but the statement that some animals are more equal than others exposes a contradiction in the highest law of the land. How can everyone be equal if some are more equal? In the case of Animal Farm and our society today, we are all presumed to be equal under the law and to have equal power. But in practice, we know this is far from reality. The concept that things can have a degree of equality is like defining equality as the difference between two animals. The opposite of more equal would be less different. Perfectly equal animals would have zero differences. The more equal the animals are, the fewer differences one would expect. The problem with communism isn't that communes don't work. It is that at the national level, they are fundamentally militant, anti-peace, and that no commune can grow organically and voluntarily from 2 people to thousands, let alone millions of people. A commune can only grow to national communism through militant, use of jungle power means. It can only maintain a communist state by violently suppressing those who have alternative ideals. In effect, while the people may be equal economically, they are not equal politically. Power in a communist system must be distributed by an extreme Pareto distribution in order to flatten the wealth distribution of the vast majority. It could be said that communism is the natural result of extreme concentration of power. Any ism that allows concentration of power will eventually attempt to use that power to evolve toward communism as a means to further concentrate power. Ironically, with concentrated power comes concentrated wealth, as there is little practical difference between control and wealth, because property is commonly defined as the right of exclusive control. I appreciate that he defined property that way. That's the best way I've found to define it as well. Though I wish he would define power more explicitly in the book. And then use it consistently. Under communism, the people become the private property and wealth of the rulers. There is little difference between communism and slavery. Historically, no communist ruling class has subjected themselves to the same rules as the people. It isn't even technically possible to do so. On paper, the rulers may own nothing, but they get exclusive use of community property, which is de facto private ownership. This book is about making people more equal in power, and letting the wealth fall where it may. The premise being that wealth is created using manpower, and if people were more equal in terms of power, then they would naturally be more equal in terms of wealth. Now I'm just begging for a definition of power that we can stick to in this book. Now we're talking manpower. Anyway. The chart above shows an abstract representative example of the normalized distribution of wealth among a population under various isms. The way you read it is that the horizontal axis represents 100 abstract people, and the vertical axis represents the net worth of each person. Under communism, 95 out of 100 people have the same wealth, practically zero, while the ruling class has almost all wealth. It is often even more extreme than I have shown. Socialism, which I will discuss next, doesn't go to the extreme of communism, but nevertheless attempts to reduce wealth inequality. Capitalism also has wealth concentration, but less so than communism and socialism. Regardless of what ism you adopt, at least 20% of the population is living in relative poverty. There is no escaping Pareto, and every attempt only makes things worse. Yeah, I think this is me talking. It's worth pointing out that capitalism is the only one of those words that does not attempt to regulate or control the wealth distribution, and And it out of the three, it results in the least concentration of wealth. That just bears highlighting. The total wealth in a society can be measured as the area under each respective curve. The half of the population living in relative poverty are often under the belief that if the rich would just share, then they could improve their standard of living. All they succeed in doing is bringing almost everyone down into poverty except the ruling class. The area under the curve shrinks. Socialism. Socialism is commonly viewed as communism light. Like Marxism, it requires total control of everything. It only differs in the extent to which the rulers aim to utilize the control. Instead of completely flattening the Pareto distribution, rulers attempt to put limits on the wealth gap between the richest and poorest. Of course, the ruling class is largely exempt from the limits on their wealth, and imposing these limits means they must have more power than everyone else. More commonly, socialism is the idea of sharing the burden of life through various social programs and safety nets. I define socialism as any system that takes from the many and gives to the few, or, the reverse, gives to the many and takes from the few. With this definition, all governments are inherently socialist organizations. They socialize the costs of national defense, natural disasters, old age, and medical care. They socialize the costs of police, prison, and bank failures. Corporations and limited liability companies are a form of socialism. They grant their owners limits on their liability, transferring the costs of that liability to the general population. I wish he had clarified state corporations and state limited liability corporations. Corporations that exist with the backing and protection of government guns are the companies that are a form of socialism, because they do grant their owners limits on their liability, which do transfer the cost of that liability to the general population, which is a form of socialism. But that only exists for the corporations that are backed by the fiat of government, like the quote-unquote legal corporations under the U.S. government, for example. You could totally have voluntary corporations that could exist in the absence of a coercive state like that, in which case that comment would not apply, because they wouldn't be able to limit their liability and transfer the costs of that liability to the general population. Non-consensually, rather, I should say. Ironically, most socialists consider corporations to be creatures of capitalism. Corporate personhood is a means of privatizing the profits and socializing the losses. Patents are a means of transferring power from everyone to the inventor or monopoly owner, and therefore socialist in nature. I don't have a problem. Hold on. Let me read that again to make sure I didn't miss something. Ironically, most socialists consider corporations to be creatures of capitalism. Corporate personhood is a means of privatizing the profits and socializing the losses. Correct. In government conceptions of corporations, correct. But not in free market versions. Patents are a means of transferring power from everyone to the inventor. I don't know what he means by power, but patents are a means of coercing everyone to transfer money to the inventor or monopoly owner. So yeah, anyway. Yeah, I don't have any big objections there. I don't have a problem with socialist community arrangements so long as participation is voluntary. I'm not sure. I mean, this is me talking now. I don't know if I would call something that was voluntarily arranged in that regard socialist. I think those two words are separate concepts that imply that somebody living in a socialist area would not necessarily get a consent. And if they did, then it would be voluntary interaction, and and voluntary interaction would mean the right to, in his words, he would say the right to secede, the right to have sovereignty over one's property and person, which would be antithetical to socialism. That's why I'm saying voluntary socialism would be a contradiction in terms. I don't think you can have that. In fact, back to the book. In fact, I think there are very sound reasons to voluntarily participate in socialist arrangements with other people. Yeah. See my previous comment on that. This can be demonstrated by the existence of a large market for voluntary insurance products and mutual aid societies. Individuals have to give up something to gain benefits of a community. Going through life solo is dangerous under the law of the jungle. The problem with socialism is its tendency to evolve into militant communism. This stems from the fact that socialism requires a concentration of power. And this concentration tends towards further concentration, of which communism is the extreme. There is little difference between socialism and communism in the minds of many people, therefore the term socialism is not a terribly useful term, except as a means of describing risk pooling and cost sharing. One of the biggest risks of socialism is moral hazard. The next chapter will dive into moral hazard in depth. Remco says, I'd like to see a discussion on patents, trademarks, etc. It's a very tricky, multifaceted aspect. What kind of discussion are you looking for? I mean, it's not a valid form of property. It's just the government coercing everyone, which is immoral. If you're looking for more than that, maybe we can find some videos that we've already made on the channel, or if you have somebody that you'd like me to discuss it with, you can let me know. Okay, next section, capitalism. Oh boy. Hopefully he does better describing capitalism than anarchism. The common definition of capitalism is an economic or political system where industry is controlled by private owners instead of the state. An alternative definition is a society governed by capital and markets. Communists might describe everything with a profit motive as being capitalistic. Many people assume that we live in a capitalist society due to the heavy profit motives of corporations, but, as you can see from the prior discussion on communism and socialism, the entire globe is governed under some degree of socialism. The companies people attribute to capitalism are creatures of socialism wearing the clothing of capitalism. A more useful term for rule by corporate entities is corporatism, which I will discuss later. Capitalism lives just above the law of the jungle in that it exists where there are no governments or formal communities. Under capitalism, ownership is enforced by informal agreement, with possession defended by jungle strength. If your private property depends upon the consensus of a community and is enforced by community police, courts, and prisons, then it isn't truly private property? It is public property, which the community is temporarily granting you the exclusive right of control. From an economic perspective, it behaves as if it were your property, but is nevertheless only yours by virtue of the socialist social arrangements. True private property is that which you retain under the law of the jungle? This needs to be teased apart. I definitely disagree with this take. Property does not exist in a state of nature. Property is an agreement between people, a consensual agreement between multiple people usually, but at least two people, to afford the respect of exclusive use to the other person, depending on what your rules are. Like a lot of people would talk about the Lockean property norms, the 3 rules of homesteading, which I argue has been much more successfully boiled down into just the single first use property norm. But he's right in that property depends upon other people reciprocating that respect with you. It is a reciprocated agreement with other people. I will not attack you. I will not damage your property. You will not attack me, and you will not damage my property. And if you do attack me or damage my property, then you lose your protection in the minds of me and anybody else watching that would, appreciate that respect continued to be afforded. what am I trying to say here? Let me try and make it really clear. So in a state of nature, or a jungle scenario, as he would describe it, like a monkey, let's say, attacking you for coming near to the tree he's in, that doesn't make the tree the monkey's property. Even if he was successfully strong and tough and nasty enough to actually chase you away from his tree, that doesn't make the tree the monkey's property. That doesn't mean we've elevated ourselves out of the state of nature. That's just might makes right. That is the absence of a consensual agreement, the absence of property, the absence of a moral philosophy. The monkey would have to be able to reciprocate that property right with the people around him and understand what property is, first of all, to be able to conceptualize property as a concept. He would have to do a lot of those things before that tree would be considered the monkey's property. Just because he's fighting to defend it doesn't mean that property exists in the jungle. I think this is an imprecise definition of property. Also, insert my rant about private property here. I don't like all the adjectives with property. I think they're unnecessary, and it's using commie language. Remco says, I find your stance on IP as a professional programmer interesting. Yeah, remember that is my career as well. I came up a coder. I'm also a photographer. I'm also a videographer. So most of my professions and most of the money that I've made in my life has come from things that are typically intrinsically linked to intellectual property. So don't think that I hold this position lightly. It was not my original position. I was sort of forced into it by the force of reason, I guess is the best way to describe it. Yeah, I don't take the topic lightly, but I'm very confident that I have arrived at the best position. There's one video that will just, if you want the 30-second version of the argument, there's one video on Disenthrall titled something like Patrick steals from you in this video, something like that. It's a really short, couple-minute video, but if you want the really short version, that would be it. And if you'd like to have a discussion with me about it, you're welcome to hit me up and I'll bring you on the show and we can talk through it. Okay, moving on. From this perspective, capitalism is as fundamental as the law of the jungle and the basis upon which all other systems are built. A kingdom may be socialist on the inside, but kingdom to kingdom trading operates on the basis of capitalism. Another way of phrasing capitalism is that he who has the gold makes the rules. I don't know why he's conflating. Consent is a thing. If it's non-consensual, then it's not capitalism because it disregards property. Capitalism is a respect for property. Respect for property means respect for consent. So if you are making involuntary rules, then you have exited the realm of capitalism and reduced yourself back down to what this guy would call the jungle. The absence of a moral framework. I don't know what else to do than to just repeat myself several times as we continue throughout this book. I think it just has to happen. Sorry. Everything that exists due to specialization, including communist and socialist systems, is the result of the voluntary exchange of goods and services under the law of the jungle. And he had me in the beginning. And then the law of the jungle thing came in. Voluntary exchange and the jungle are mutually exclusive. You don't have voluntary exchange in the jungle. In the jungle, you don't have consent. Consent doesn't exist in the jungle. Might makes right. The absence of consent. The absence of concept even. Animals exist in the jungle, so to speak. So maybe I'm using jungle differently than he is, and maybe I've completely misunderstood how he's using the jungle. But I don't think I have. I think he's got it wrong. There's no point in being against capitalism Everything is therefore the result of capitalism. There is no point in being against capitalism or for capitalism because capitalism is like the ether, always and everywhere present. What people are for or against is the degree of socialism in the definition and enforcement of practical property rights. Whew. Enforcement of enforcement of practical property rights is not necessarily socialist in nature. This seems to be a leftist's view of property in general or something. I don't know. I'll let you know if I figure it out. Since I view property rights as a peace treaty, I view them as malleable. If one wanted to be, quote, fair, then true property rights are those negotiated among people with equal jungle power. We will cover property rights in greater detail in later chapters. Property rights as malleable. Yeah, so if I want to consent with my neighbor to have a weird rubric of sharing some of our property and not sharing other parts of our property consensually, yeah, they can be malleable in that regard, sure. When I move into my HOA, I signed a contract that had customized restrictions on my property, on my house. So they are malleable. And then he says, if one wanted to be fair, then true property rights are those negotiated among people with equal jungle power. I'm not sure anybody could ever have equal jungle power, nor why that would be. Property rights negotiated among people with equal jungle power? No. If one wanted to be fair, true property rights would need to be universalizable. That would be the ultimate fair in property rights, not negotiated ad hoc with somebody's disparate power affecting the distribution of property rights. That would necessarily be a less fair system of or property agreement. That would necessarily be a less fair distribution of property rights than if the property rights you were agreeing on were universalizable, which is what I advocate for. If a property right is universalizable, that means that it applies and is in effect in all times, places, in for and by all people. That is definitionally the most fair. And so you have to plug in universal property rights into that equation to get it. But once you've done so, it's definitionally the most fair. That would be the quintessential fairness of property rights distribution. Libertarianism. If you wanted a slightly more useful word than capitalism, you could use libertarianism to describe the system of voluntary trade, absent limited liability and corporate personhood. Okay, this is me talking again. Limited liability corporations and corporate personhood can exist without the state, just with through voluntary contract instead of the guns of the state. A libertarian community defines property rights in advance via a peace treaty, and said rights are only transferred by contract. A libertarian community resolves disputes by restoring lost property to its rightful owner as closely as possible. Technically, the process of, quote, defining property rights in advance and resolving disputes is dependent upon community consensus and therefore is socialist in nature? What? No, property is an agreement between individuals. A bunch of individuals agreeing does not make it socialized. It's still individual, and each individual can still individually continue to consent, opt out, modify their individual agreements. I think we've improperly collectivized people here, and therefore it's not socialist in nature. But that limited degree of socialism shouldn't taint an otherwise practical definition of libertarianism. Well, that's good, because it doesn't. Libertarians follow the non-aggression principle, which states that no one should initiate violence or threat thereof against another and allows defending yourself and your property with violence. The primary challenge with libertarian systems is getting people to agree on the initial definition of property and on the process of dispute resolution. The definition of aggression is also widely disputed, especially with respect to endangerment. Is it aggression to point a gun but not shoot, assuming no threats? Is it aggression to play Russian roulette while pointing the gun at someone else? Is it aggression to drive drunk? Is it aggression to expose someone to the flu? Does aggression depend on the gun going off, the car crashing, or someone catching the flu? Well, there's answers to all those questions. Well, let's proceed. Those who are heavily dogmatic about their libertarian beliefs are resistant to anything that smells of socialism and therefore have a hard time negotiating peace treaties. Well, that's true. That was in my introduction to the book when I said that, we as individualists resist any attempts to come up with a system of organization. So I think he's got that right. They're very dogmatic about their, maybe not libertarian beliefs, but their individual consent. We tend to be very dogmatic about our consent, our self-ownership, because day in and day out, every moment of our day, it is being trampled on and ignored. And so, yeah, it's easy to be heavily dogmatic about that for sure. And that would naturally make us very resistant to anything that smells of socialism. And therefore, we have a hard time negotiating peace treaties. Yeah, that's well said. While voluntarists generally support the principles of libertarians, they are more open-minded to socialistic arrangements? Okay, well, we're using his definitions here. To me, the word libertarian and voluntarist are identical. They're both focused on consent. Democratism. This book is about true democracy, which I submit is the voluntary process by which a group of people or group of organizations reach consensus so that the members of the group can act as one and resolve disputes without taking power from the people. Democracy is government derived from the ongoing consent of the people as demonstrated by the right of secession. I mean, that's the indoctrinated definition of the word that we're all taught since birth, but no democracy like that has ever existed. I've said that so many times in this book. With a true democracy, the people can establish everything from a libertarian community to any degree of socialism. The primary difference between true democratic socialism and dino-socialism, democratic in name-only socialism, is that power is truly decentralized under true democratic socialism, whereas power is extremely concentrated under dino-socialism and communism. An argument has been made that democracies devolve into communism as soon as the people realize they can vote to take from the rich and give to the poor. It is my belief that this is only true for dinos, which violate the principles of true democracy by enabling factionalism and actively resisting secession. If the rich have the right to secede, then any democracy that threatened them in any way they feel is unjust would lose their most wealthy citizens. It is like attempting to kill the goose which lays the golden eggs. Ironically, it is often the richest who advocate for socialism, communism, because it increases their relative power and therefore their relative wealth. A typical libertarian will argue against democracy on the ground that the minority do not consent. At the same time, libertarians will argue for arbitration in which two people voluntarily submit to the rule of a third person. What? Same time, libertarians will argue. So let me read this again. A typical libertarian will argue against democracy on the ground that the minority did not consent. Correct. The problem is a lack of consent. At the same time, libertarians will argue for arbitration in which two people voluntarily submit to the rule of a third person. Okay, if they voluntarily submit, then it's not rule. Ruling is non-consensual. That sentence is wrong. Non sequitur. That is not a contradiction. It tries to state a contradiction that does not exist. Voluntarily agreed to arbitration is consensual, which makes it not being ruled by the third person, the arbiter. It's not rule if it's consensual, which makes it the opposite of democracy. Man, I feel like I'm repeating myself. If I am, if I'm repeating myself too much, let me know and I'll shut up and try and read more. But I'm just basically giving you my brain thoughts as they come out. Decompiler says, I said what at the same time? You did? Oh, that's hilarious. The key, okay, back to the book. The key is that people consent to the process and then abide by the outcome. Yeah, exactly. That's the key. That's also not rule. Democracy, voluntarily joined, is just a multi-party dispute resolution process. Sure. Yes. Everyone is better off acting as a group even if some of the members disagree with the group decision. Again, yes, that's true. And we as staunch individualists could definitely stand to get better at abiding by group decisions we disagree with. For sure. As long as it's consensual, right? Okay, anyway, continuing on. True democracy is about coordinating with other people while maintaining personal autonomy and power. Your power is best represented as the right and abilities to secede. Your power is the right and ability to secede. That's like the 5th definition of power I've come across in this book. I am now thoroughly confused when he uses the word power. And I don't just mean that pedantically. I mean, I'm actually now less sure than I ever was before what he means when he says power. Dino systems give the people the appearance of political power while stealing its substance and giving it to a ruling class. That last sentence was a good one. Moral hazard. The study of economics and game theory. This is a new chapter. The chapter is called Moral Hazard. We'll probably go... we'll go like another... We'll just try and finish this next chapter, hopefully. Moral hazard. The study of economics and game theory is about understanding the incentives that motivate human action. The type of incentives can greatly impact the outcome for the people involved. Generally speaking, you want to structure incentives such that people are aligned toward the same goal and avoid situations where one person has incentive or temptation to harm another. We call these situations moral hazard because the outcome is somewhat dependent upon the moral character of the people you interact with. Even if everyone is a, quote, good person, bad incentives can compromise how parties perceive and value things to an extent that bad things still happen. While it is called moral hazard, it ultimately doesn't depend upon any single definition of morality. Instead, it is a matter of other people making choices that benefit themselves at the expense of someone else. Understanding moral hazard is critical for true democracies because misaligned incentives will quietly turn even the most honest and noble people against one another. It leads to systematic corruption that doesn't serve the interest of the people. If you are... I know I've said this before, but I can't not say it again. The people do not have an interest. You have a bunch of people, all with different interests. Individuals. If you are... But, that said... This chapter on moral hazards, I don't think I have a lot of objections to. This is really good information, really good stuff to learn when you're looking at designing or working in systems like this. Like, if you're about to work in a system with somebody else, in some kind of agreement with somebody else, it's really good to be aware of moral hazards so that you can look for them, so that you can design them out of the system, because it will eliminate a lot of conflicts and disagreements. Let's see. If you're going to negotiate a contract, I just said this. If you're going to negotiate a contract or peace treaty with others, you want to ensure there are minimal moral hazards that motivate or tempt them to betray you, either consciously or unconsciously. One of the greatest signs of moral hazard is when one person chooses and another person pays. Suppose you're going on a business trip and your employer is buying dinner. Assume that 100% of the cost is being covered by your employer. The temptation is to buy a higher quality and larger quantity of food from the best restaurant in town. In this case, the benefits of a nice meal accrue to you and the costs to your employer. The hazard exists even if you're a good person and consciously try to eat no differently than you would on your own. From the perspective of an economist, we can say that value isn't revealed until a choice is made, as demonstrated by action taken. You may claim to value education more than entertainment, but if you always choose to watch TV over studying, then your true values are revealed. That is a really good sentence. That is really good. Why do I not have that highlighted? Hang on. That's really good. That's funny. Right before I decided to do this stream, I was like, man, this is Sunday. I'm not feeling any work today. I just want to play some video games. And then I was like, man, but I need to get some reading done. And so it was in that moment where my true value was revealed. Through your actions. That's really good. Good to know. Good to watch in other people too. You may claim to value education more than entertainment, but if you always choose to watch TV over studying, then your true values are revealed. Likewise, you can claim that you would have ordered a steak on your own dime, but without being able to observe the alternate reality, we will never really know. A similar process occurs if you go out to dinner with a large group of friends and agree to split the check evenly. You know what else comes to mind from that same sentence above? Back to the Stoic thing. You are what you repeatedly do. Like, your values are your actions. Yeah, good stuff. Good stuff to think about. You can't say that you have a XYZ. You couldn't say that you value and abide by the non-aggression principle if you go around punching people and taxing them and voting, for example. Yeah, that's good. Everyone who orders a meal above the average... Let me start that paragraph over. A similar process occurs if you go out to dinner with a large group of friends and agree to split the check evenly. Everyone who orders a meal above the average cost benefits, and everyone else loses. The temptation is to order more than the average. This temptation is made worse when you realize everyone is tempted to order more than normal. Things get even worse if the group is a random set of strangers who may never share a meal together again. The tendency is for the group to spend far more than the average of what they would have spent if everyone paid for their own meal. Now, imagine you and your friends get together for dinner every week, and the same people always order the most expensive meals. One of two things will happen. Those ordering cheaper meals will stop attending, or the group will stop inviting those who order more expensive meals. With multiple iterations, reputation and voluntary membership, the moral hazard is greatly reduced. Without multiple iterations, reputation doesn't have time to be discovered. Without voluntary membership or exclusion, there is no way to counteract abuse. Reason number 10,001 why government is the worst thing ever. Imagine everyone was required to attend the meal and pay. Imagine everyone was required to attend the meal and pay their equal share. At the first meal, some people may be more economical in their choices and others more spendthrift. After observing the outcome of the first meal, the economical parties will become more spendthrift on the second meal so that they get their fair share and don't feel like they are subsidizing others. This raises the average cost on the second meal. The third meal will be even worse. This process will continue until everyone orders whatever they want or until some members are unable to afford the bill. Once some members are unable to afford the bill, the temptation is to ask others to pick up their tab. If the group agrees to divide the bill according to each member's ability to pay, then the moral hazard continues to drive up consumption until there is nothing left to consume, or even the most well-off are unable to pay. While some members of the group may speak up and say this is wasteful, they are trapped with a choice between subsidizing everyone else, or getting their fair share. For every dollar they reduce their consumption, they only reduce their share of the bill by pennies. The larger the group, the greater the moral hazard. Imagine a community club with 100 members who get dinner every Sunday at their favorite restaurant. In order to simplify billing, the restaurant sets up 10 tables of 10 people. Each table is required to split their bill evenly, but people may choose to sit at any table. The consequence of this setup is that the economical members will pick one table and the spendthrifts will be shunned from most tables and forced to dine together. People would tend to group according to the amount they feel is economical for them to personally spend. Each group may even reach a consensus to place a cap on how much any one person can spend. These caps would operate like an employer giving you a per diem food budget while you travel. Each person's spending will approach the limit as they either use it or lose it. So, while limits may prevent runaway consumption, they do not encourage economical choices. What is more, these limits artificially force some people to live below their means. While allowing people to group helps reduce waste, waste can be further reduced by enabling more groups, which means smaller groups, with the limit being everyone pays for their own meal. A group of people going out to eat is most economical when people pay their own way. When costs are shared, people start spending other people's money, and costs spiral up and out of control due to moral hazard. A crafty restaurant would require that each table split the bill evenly among everyone at the table. By forcing people into a system with moral hazard, the restaurant owner is the beneficiary. In a market with competition, many people would opt out of such a restaurant in favor of other restaurants where people can get cheaper meals by not subsidizing the spendthrifts. Now, imagine if you couldn't opt out, and that instead of food, it was all government services. That is government. Hooray. Decompiler says, I used to run with a crew that would play the credit card game, where the server would draw who pays out of a hat of credit cards. I lost twice and stopped doing that. Holy crap. Huh. Wow. That's like the maximum moral hazard. So if you go out with 6 people, you have like a, 15% chance of paying? So of course you'd balance that by ordering more. Oh, that's terrible. Insurance. Insurance is a situation where a group of people decide to make equal payments to offset a risk that is unlikely to strike everyone. If we assume people can come together to insure against lightning strikes, and the probability is that 1 in 1 million people get struck by lightning each year, and the payout in event of lightning strike is $1 million, then each person would pay $1 per year. A moral hazard exists when some people choose to live in Florida while others live in Virginia. The probability of being hit in Florida is much higher than in Virginia. Moral hazard also exists when some people realize there is a 90% survival rate from lightning strikes and that it might just be worth $1 million to risk death. These people go out in the rain and fly kites. Holy crap. All insurance systems must do their best to group people according to risk profiles. Those willing to take actions to reduce risk should be grouped together. Anyone caught flying a kite in the rain would be disqualified from collecting lightning insurance. Residents of Florida would be in a different group than residents in Virginia and therefore should pay higher premiums. The takeaway is that moral hazard is prevalent whenever a group is pooling resources to spend. Countermeasures must be implemented if moral hazard cannot be fully avoided. Note that all corporate structures suffer from moral hazard. In the case of medical insurance, those who are more likely to get sick are more likely to buy insurance, with low deductibles, low copay, and low co-insurance. Those who are less likely to get sick will pay higher deductibles, copays, and co-insurance. The presence of deductibles and copays causes people to self-sort into low-risk and high-risk pools. Someone who must pay for half their medical bills has more incentive to reduce costs than someone who only has to pay for 1% of their bills. To prevent this self-sorting, which would cause premiums to spike for the sickly, insurance companies force people to group by other means, such as a common employer. This would be like the weekly community dinner randomly assigning people to groups of 10 instead of allowing self-selection. The effective outcome is similar to having one global group, as every smaller group would have a random sampling of spendthrifts or sickly people. Imagine a dinner for two where the couple agree to split the bill evenly because each person is ultimately responsible for half of their spending. They are less likely to run up the bill. In a group of 100 people, each person is only responsible for 1% of their additional spending, so moral hazard takes over and costs rise much faster. Deductibles, co-pays, and co-insurance are ways of minimizing moral hazard in insurance systems by recreating the economic conditions of a smaller group. Now, consider that insurance companies have overhead and aim to make a profit. If the insurance company makes 10% on every dollar spent on medical care, then they are like a restaurant owner who forces tables to split the bill evenly. Their goal is to maximize the number of people at each table, in each risk pool, and then to maximize the number of conditions covered. For the insurance company owner, the ideal would be everyone in one group and all conditions and treatments are covered. Interesting. For the insurance company owner, the ideal would be everyone in one group and all conditions and treatments are covered. Even if the insurance company is non-profit, it still has to employ people, and those employees benefit from job security and higher salaries. Consider also that it is not just the insurance company that benefits from the moral hazard. Every doctor, drug manufacturer, and medical device manufacturer also profits by increased demand for their services. In order to counteract this moral hazard, universal medical care must dictate all prices of all services, and also control what services are available and to whom. This just creates even more moral hazards. In this case, the person choosing is a government employee, and the person paying with both money and the consequences of their chosen or denied treatment is you. An insurance company also has incentive to misprice risk by overcharging the under-delivering. Boy, I just lost the ability to read. An insurance company also has incentive to misprice risk by overcharging and under-delivering coverage. If the insurance company gets to keep the difference between premiums collected and claims paid out, then it has incentive to underpay claims. If it is the judge of its own claim process, then there is a lack of impartiality and a temptation to deny claims. Upton Sinclair has a famous quote, "It is difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends upon his not understanding it." This is an example of moral hazard, and in many cases it is unconscious. Our brains are wired to see what we want to see and be blind to what we don't want to see. The presence of moral hazard is one of those things that we don't want to see when we are benefiting from it. We don't want to see our own corruption or our own bias. We can't help but be biased, even with constant vigilance and training. We are all unconscious of all the subtle bias created by the incentives of the games we set up for ourselves. Moral hazards and democracies. Traditional governments are like restaurants that everyone is forced to attend and where everyone is splitting the bill. They are like insurance plans that everyone is subscribed to, which are supposed to insure against threats to our life, liberty, and property by providing justice for all. Democracy is supposed to be the process by which the people choose who runs the insurance company, who judges the disputes, and what claims are covered. Communism is a diner where everyone can order whatever they want and the price is 90% of their paycheck. But there is little produced, so nothing available to order. Socialism is a diner that costs 50% of your paycheck and you pay 50% of the cost of your meal, while basic meals are free. Libertarianism is everyone pays for their own meal and may voluntarily give meals to those who cannot afford them. When viewed from the perspective of moral hazard, it is pretty clear why communism fails and libertarianism generally produces prosperity. The reason the art of true democracy is subtle is because of moral hazard and the challenge of designing systems that minimize or counter it. Everyone working in government jobs is subject to moral hazard because they are spending everyone else's money, including when they cash their paychecks. That was me. I added the last bit. Reducing government spending means government employees lose their jobs. Reducing conflict of interest reduces the opportunity for bribes. Eliminating the two-party system causes some people to lose power and influence. Telling hard truths reduces the chance of election. Peace is inconvenient for those who profit from war. Health is inconvenient for those who profit from medical treatments. The very act of voting is a moral hazard if 51% can take everything from the 49%. We have seen that the solutions to moral hazard are minimizing group size, repetition, and reputation. Furthermore, voluntary memberships and ability to exclude from groups is key to leveraging reputation to mitigate moral hazard. True democracy structures itself to counteract moral hazard as much as possible. Dinos structure themselves to maximize moral hazard because increasing moral hazards is to the benefit of those who run the government. The government is like the restaurant attempting to profit by maximizing the moral hazard among its customers. The more moral hazard faced within social institutions, the more demand there is for government to, quote, solve the problems created by moral hazard. In effect, the consequence of moral hazard in government is the propagation of more and more kinds of moral hazard. Good government based upon the principles of true democracy is in the business of eliminating and minimizing moral hazard wherever it can be found. All right, the next chapter is titled Corporatism, but we're going to save that for next time. I need to rest my voice a bit before I chat with Christian later. If you're not subscribed over, I think it's Liberty After Dark, you go give that channel a subscribe. I will be on with him at 8 p.m. Central today. I will see you guys soon. Have a great day. If you have any comments or thoughts on this series, I will definitely read them. Drop them in the comments. Y'all have a... Decompilers have good government. Yeah, I've said that so many times. I'm trying not to repeat my criticisms too much, but yeah. He uses the word government differently in this book. I think he holds that government... you could have a consensual government, even though that's a contradiction in terms as far as we see it. But to him, he's trying to describe a consensual government, which he calls true democracy. I really think it would serve him well to use a different word than government, because no government that's ever existed has been consensual. So it's just like conceptually, yes, you could define a government as a voluntary contract between people, I guess. You could choose to think about it like that, but it's never ever existed like that. That's never ever been a thing. And so you're literally, every single time you describe what you're wanting, you're going to have to redefine that word, or at least define it explicitly. And then you're going to have to sidestep all of the subconscious emotions, connotations, and understandings that are linked to coercive governments. So, I mean, it's his book. He can do what he wants, but I would not do it that way. All right, guys, I'll see you next time. Hope you enjoy it.